It was a battle that unfolded in the heart of the Pacific, where the fate of empires hung in the balance, and a single misstep could change the course of history. In just a few days, the tides of war shifted forever, not with armies clashing on land, but with steel giants burning on open seas and brave men fighting to their last breath. This is not just the story of victory or defeat. It's the moment when one nation's dream of dominance began to sink, and another's path to triumph was set in motion. As daylight broke, the sun cast elongated shadows across the deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi. Admiral Kiichi Nagumo stood on the command bridge, his hands firmly grasping the railing. It was June 4, 1942. The Imperial Japanese Navy's elite strike group moved forward with purpose, convinced they were on the brink of a defining triumph. The Pacific Ocean stretched ahead in calm silence, betraying no sign of the brutal clash soon to come. Records preserved in Walter Lord's incredible victory described the Japanese fleet's morale as extraordinarily high. Leading the charge was Nagumo's first air fleet, the Kyobuta Japan's most powerful naval force, consisting of 4 main carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Each carrier was loaded with dozens of aircraft, backed by a robust screen of warships that included battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. This was the same powerful armada that had attacked Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier. The crews, emboldened by past victories, were certain of their superiority. The mastermind of the campaign was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the strategic leader of Japan's naval operations in the Pacific. His bold idea was to draw out what remained of the American Pacific Fleet and destroy it in a final, conclusive engagement near Midway, a remote atoll seen as a gateway to Hawaii. Intelligence reports indicated that the Americans had only a small number of aircraft carriers, likely too few to resist the might of Japan's naval strength. Meanwhile, Captain Mitsuo Fukita, famed for leading the attack on Pearl Harbor, moved among the pilots and crew who were readying themselves for the morning strike. The young flyers were calm and self-assured, dressed immaculately, and surrounded by perfectly maintained gear. Their quiet conversations were filled with anticipation, convinced this encounter would bring an end to U.S. resistance in the Pacific. Below the flight deck, mechanics toiled through the night preparing the aircraft Nakajima B-5NS, torpedo bombers nicknamed Kates, and Aichi D-3A dive bombers known as Vals. The scent of fuel blended with the salty sea breeze, and the steady hum of engines filled the air, creating an industrial rhythm that pulsed toward the dawn. However, the Japanese forces were unaware that their secret communications had been deciphered. In the lower levels of a naval intelligence center at Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his code-breaking team had been tirelessly analyzing intercepted signals. They had confirmed that AF referred to Midway, prompting Admiral Chester Nimitz to carefully position the American fleet in response. Though the U.S. had fewer ships, they had been placed with deliberate precision. One group, Task Force 16 under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, included the carriers Enterprise, and Hornet. Another group, Task Force 17, led by Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, was centered around the recently repaired Yorktown and stationed northeast of Midway. The Americans had chosen to wait patiently, hiding their strength and preparing for a decisive strike. At 4:30 a.m., Japanese planes roared into the air from the carrier decks. The initial attack force included 108 aircraft, 36 Nakajima-level bombers, 36 Aichi dive bombers, and 36 Mitsubishi Zero fighters. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led the mission, his hardened expression set with resolve as he guided the wave of aircraft through the breaking dawn. The air assault began precisely at 6:20 a.m. The Japanese bombers descended upon Midway like wrathful spirits, targeting military installations, fuel stores, and defensive emplacements with deadly precision. Explosions rocked the small island, as buildings collapsed and grounded planes erupted in flames. Though the Marine defenders had anticipated an attack, the intensity was beyond what they had prepared for. Captain William Humber, leading the U.S. Marine detachment, could only watch as his well-laid defenses were overwhelmed. Fire burst in the skies, but the enemy pilots maneuvered expertly through the flak. On the ground, surviving Marine aviators raced to launch what aircraft remained. Major Lofton Henderson spearheaded a desperate counteroffensive with Douglas, Dauntless dive bombers and Grumman Wildcat fighters. The odds were grim, but the American pilots fought with relentless courage. The air above Midway turned into a chaotic battlefield of spinning aircraft, gunfire, and smoke. Though their valor was unquestionable, the outdated American planes were no match for the seasoned Japanese Zero pilots. Henderson himself was shot down in the fray, his aircraft engulfed in flames before it struck the ocean. Of the 27 Marine planes launched, only a few made it back. Back aboard the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo faced a difficult choice. Lieutenant Tominaga had reported that Midway remained partially functional and suggested a second bombing run. The admiral had to decide whether to launch another strike on the island or keep his reserve planes armed for a potential engagement with enemy warships. He opted to prepare for a second raid on Midway, ordering the switch from torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, to high explosives. Below deck, crews hurried to make the change. Torpedoes and heavy munitions were stacked aside, while the planes were reloaded with general-purpose bombs. What Nagumo didn't yet realize was that American reconnaissance aircraft had already found his fleet. At 7:28 a.m., Ensign Jack Reed, piloting a PB Catalina, broke radio silence with a crucial report. Enemy carriers spotted at a bearing of 320 degrees, roughly 180 miles away. The transmission was quickly relayed to Admiral Spruance's forces, who wasted no time in preparing their counterstrike. As the sun continued to rise, the American carriers aligned into the wind. On the deck of the Enterprise, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey readied his bombers for takeoff, his thoughts fixed on the enemy's position. Through the ship's intercom, final orders echoed as crews performed last checks on their aircraft. Despite being at maximum range, Spruance gave the green light to launch. The risk was high, but catching the Japanese carriers during their vulnerable rearming phase was an opportunity too valuable to pass up. By 7 a.m., American aircraft began to rise into the skies, 116 in all. This massive wave included Dauntless, dive bombers, Devastator, torpedo bombers, and Wildcat fighters. Even the battle-worn Yorktown contributed 35 planes to the assault. It was the largest air attack ever launched from U.S. carriers up to that point. However, the mission faced serious complications. The long-distance flight strained fuel supplies, and navigating the vast ocean was a challenge. Some units got separated in the clouds or missed their targets entirely. Meanwhile, on the Japanese carriers, frantic activity continued as crews raced to prepare their planes for a second strike. Fuel lines and explosives littered the decks. Nagumo had received conflicting reports from scouts about U.S. ships in the vicinity. One message mentioned 10 vessels but failed to specify their type. Then, at 8 a.m., a long-delayed message from a scout plane confirmed what Nagumo had feared. A U.S. force, possibly with a carrier, had been sighted at a bearing of 010 degrees, 140 miles away. The realization hit him like a blow. The Americans were approaching, and his own fleet was in a dangerously exposed state. His carrier's decks were cluttered, and aircraft were still below in the hangars. At 9:20 a.m., McCluskey's voice came, over the radio, from high above. He had spotted the Japanese fleet spread out beneath him. Their position was perfect for a strike. The Enterprise pilot had spent nearly 2 hours searching, with his fuel nearing empty, before he finally followed the trail of a lone Japanese destroyer back to the fleet. McCluskey's 37 dive bombers were joined by 17 more from the Yorktown under Max Leslie, forming a deadly group of 54 aircraft diving from 17,000 feet. At that exact moment, the Japanese carriers were at their weakest. Planes on the deck were being refueled and loaded with bombs. Fighters had descended to defend against torpedo planes. Just as Nagumo was preparing to launch his counterstrike, warning cries rang out. American dive bombers were descending rapidly. He looked skyward to see them rolling into steep dives, sunlight glinting off their wings as they hurtled toward his ship. The next 5 minutes would later be described as the turning point of the war. But for those aboard the Japanese carriers, it was a nightmare of fire and destruction. McCluskey's lead bombers focused on the Akagi. One bomb slammed into the deck near the bridge, detonating inside the hangar among loaded aircraft. Another struck further aft, igniting stored fuel and munitions hastily stacked during the earlier confusion. Captain Taijiro Aoki could only watch as his ship turned into an inferno. Fires tore through the interior, trapping many inside. The carrier, once the pride of the fleet, now burned uncontrollably. At the same time, Richard Best and his squadron turned their sights on the Kaga. It was an ideal target, huge, exposed, and bustling with activity. Best's bomb landed amidships, punching through to the hangar and exploding. Several more bombs followed quickly, each causing additional havoc. Captain Jisaku Okada felt the ship tremble as secondary explosions rocked the vessel. Smoke poured from torn sections of the flight deck. Despite frantic efforts by damage control teams, the fire advanced faster than they could contain it at the same time. The dive bombers from the Yorktown, led by Max Leslie, had locked in on the Japanese carrier, Soryu. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto was on the bridge when the American planes appeared overhead. He managed to issue one final order to change course before the bombs began raining down. The first struck near the front of the flight deck, tossing parked aircraft like toys in a windstorm. The next two bombs hit almost immediately afterward, triggering explosions that engulfed the vessel in flames. Standing on the bridge of the Hiryu, Captain Tomio Kaku watched the smoke trails of the other carriers as they burned in the distance. Now isolated, the Hiryu was the last surviving carrier of the once feared First Air Fleet. But her commander had no intention of surrendering. At 10:15 a.m., he ordered every operational aircraft to take off 18 Aichi dive bombers and 6 Mitsubishi Zero fighters under Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. These were veteran airmen, many of whom had attacked Pearl Harbor, and they were consumed by a burning urge for revenge. While those aircraft departed, Air U.S. crew prepared for another offensive, fully aware their time was running short. Meanwhile, aboard the Yorktown, Admiral Frank Fletcher pushed forward with flight operations despite previous battle damage. The crew worked with skilled urgency, launching defensive fighters and readying for the incoming assault. Radar operators scanned their displays, searching for any signs of the enemy's approach. Just before noon, at 11:55 a.m., the radar screens detected a group of incoming aircraft, 46 miles out. Alarms rang throughout the Yorktown, prompting a scramble response. From the crew, 12 Wildcat fighters took off to intercept the attack, the pilots knowing they were outnumbered but resolute in their defense. The aerial clash that followed was intense and disorganized. The Japanese planes, outdated but highly maneuverable, weaved through enemy fire as American pilots twisted and climbed to intercept them. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, leading the Yorktown's fighters, employed new strategies to level the playing field against the more agile Zeros, but the enemy's numbers were overwhelming. 7 dive bombers broke through and started their descent toward the Yorktown. Flak and tracer rounds filled the sky as the carrier's anti-aircraft guns opened up. But the attacking pilots pressed in undeterred. The first bomb tore through the deck and detonated below, killing or injuring 66 men. A second bomb hit near the command tower, igniting fires and disabling defensive stations. A third struck the smokestack, damaging the ventilation to 5 of the ship's 6 boilers. The Yorktown lost propulsion and came to a halt, her interior filled with smoke while destroyers formed a protective screen around her. But the cost to the attackers was severe. Only 5 of the 18 Japanese bombers made it back. American defenses had taken a heavy toll, and the returning crews were drained and demoralized. Knowing the odds, Captain Kaku ordered one last strike from Hiryu. At 12:45 p.m., the carrier launched her final offensive. 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zero fighters led by Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, the same man who had led the morning raid on Midway. Tomonaga's plane had been damaged earlier, his fuel tank punctured, but he insisted on leading this mission. Fully aware he lacked enough fuel to return, wind rushed through the bullet holes in his aircraft as Tomonaga headed toward the American fleet, flying low on fuel but high in resolve. Behind him, the remaining torpedo bombers and fighter escorts followed with grim purpose. They knew this might be their final mission. Awaiting them, Admiral Spruance had deployed his fighters in multiple defensive layers. Outer rings of Wildcats moved to intercept early, while inner defenses braced for anything that slipped through. The carriers Enterprise and Hornet had also launched bombers aimed at the Hiryu, setting the stage for a deadly contest that would depend entirely on timing. 2:30 p.m., the first American interceptors clashed with Tomonaga's force. The sky erupted into chaos as Wildcats and Zeros engaged each other in close-quarters dogfighting. Meanwhile, the Japanese torpedo planes continued toward their target. Commander Jimmy Flatley led the fighters from Enterprise, executing precision strikes using tactics designed to counter the Zero's agility. The Japanese formation was torn apart as plane after plane was shot down in flames. Tomonaga's bomber took heavy hits, smoke streaming from the engine, yet he stayed on course even as his aircraft began to fall apart. Only 2 torpedo bombers survived long enough to reach the Yorktown. The carrier, miraculously restored to 20 knots thanks to tireless damage control efforts, tried to avoid the incoming attack. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire once more, painting the air with deadly bursts. The first torpedo slammed into the Yorktown's port side with a tremendous boom, followed by a second that flooded engine compartments and killed electrical power. The vessel began tilting sharply as seawater poured into the breaches. Captain Elliot Buckmaster gave the order to evacuate, believing the ship was finished. Yet, as her crew fought to keep her afloat, the American counterattack was already on its way to the Hiryu. Commander Clarence McCluskey, running dangerously low on fuel after earlier missions, stepped forward to lead a final wave of 24 Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise. He knew the weight of this mission, the last blow against the fleet he had already helped cripple. Locating the Hiryu wasn't easy in the vast ocean, but the pilots followed rising smoke columns from the already burning Japanese carriers to find their final target. At 4:45 p.m., the dive bombers reached the enemy formation. Japanese lookouts raised the alarm, recognizing the familiar threat. Captain Kaku ordered evasive action, but the Hiryu deck was cluttered with planes being prepped for another launch, and fuel and explosives packed her hangars. As the American bombers plunged into their dives, each one aimed with deadly precision. The first bomb tore through the front of the flight deck, igniting fires that quickly spread. A second bomb hit midship and exploded deep inside the hangar. Among loaded munitions, a third landed near the rear, sealing the carrier's fate. As the sun sank low, the sky was painted in red and gold, and 4 of Japan's fleet carriers burned in the distance like floating funeral pyres. Akagi, the pride of the First Air Fleet, was the first to be given up. At 7:25 p.m., Admiral Nagumo transferred his command to the cruiser Nagara. Watching with a heavy heart, he ordered the evacuation of the doomed vessel. Captain Taijiro Aoki stayed at his post on the bridge, holding tight to the rail as more explosions rocked the ship. A final massive detonation from the ship's munitions lit up the night and sent wreckage raining down. Before Akagi disappeared beneath the waves at 5:20 a.m. on June 5th, Kaga went down around the same time that evening. Intense fires, burning since the morning, finally destroyed her hull. Captain Jisaku Okada remained on board to oversee the evacuation, disappearing into the smoke as his ship capsized. The rising sun emblem still visible as it vanished beneath the ocean surface. Soryu's end was just as sorrowful. Captain Yena, mortally wounded during the attack, refused evacuation. As flames swept through the carrier and secondary explosions rocked her, he chose to die with his crew. At 7:13 p.m., the ship's magazine exploded in a fiery blast that marked the end of another mighty vessel. Haryu held on the longest. Captain Kaku directed heroic efforts to save her, but the damage was too severe. Eventually, with no hope left, he ordered the ship to be scuttled early on June 5th at 12:30 a.m. to prevent her from falling into enemy hands. The human cost of this battle was devastating. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen died in the destruction of the four carriers. Many of them experienced veterans who had spearheaded Japan's sweeping victories across the Pacific. Among them was Mitsuo Fukita, the pilot who had led the Pearl Harbor raid. Wounded during the fighting and trapped in the Akagi's infirmary, he perished when the ship went down. His death marked the symbolic end of Japan's dominance in the Pacific air war, a supremacy that would never return. The losses didn't stop with the carriers. The heavy cruiser Mogami, damaged while trying to retreat, was struck by American bombers the next day. Her ammunition stores detonated in a massive explosion, adding one more ship to the list of Japan's shattered fleet. The cruiser, Mogami, which had also sustained damage during the crash, barely managed to survive. Her frame was warped, and her upper sections were heavily damaged. Yet perhaps the most impactful loss wasn't physical, it was psychological. The belief in Japan's unstoppable might, which had powered its early victories, was deeply shaken. The Kido Butte had symbolized Japanese dominance across the Pacific, projecting their influence wherever they wished. Its destruction at Midway struck a devastating blow to Japan's morale and marked the start of an irreversible pullback toward their homeland. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood silently aboard the battleship Yamato, staring at the flood of grim updates. He was the mind behind Pearl Harbor, the one who had cautioned that Japan might dominate the Pacific for only half a year. Now, with painful precision, his own prophecy was playing out. It was June 5, 1942, and what would become Japan's most devastating naval defeat was happening before him. Radio reports from the withdrawing fleet painted a harrowing scene. The Akagi had been lost just after 5 in the morning. The Kaga went down that evening. The Soryu had been destroyed in an explosion not long before. Each message cut deep into Yamamoto's spirit, not just because of the destruction of vessels and men, but because Japan's whole Pacific strategy was collapsing. Captain Kameto Kuroshima, Yamamoto's top aide, tried to propose a path forward. He suggested using the remaining battleships to launch a night offensive, perhaps salvaging some pride. But Yamamoto understood the harsh truth. Without air protection, his capital ships were helpless against American planes. The era of battleships had ended. Aircraft carriers had become the new rulers of the sea. Worse than the loss of hardware was the devastation among the air crews. Over 300 planes were gone, along with Japan's best-trained pilotsmen, who had taken years to prepare and could not simply be replaced. Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, a leading dive bomber ace, died during the attack on the Yorktown. Commander Takahashi Agusa, a veteran of earlier victories, perished in the fire aboard the Soryu. These deaths left a void the Japanese would struggle to fill for the remainder of the conflict. On the American side, there was both mourning and celebration. Losing the Yorktown was painful. After suffering serious damage, the carrier was finally lost on June 7 when a Japanese submarine, 1-168, struck her with torpedoes as she was being towed. But the cost was acceptable, considering that Japan's entire mobile naval power had been dismantled. Admiral Chester Nimitz, leading the Pacific Fleet, received word of the triumph at Pearl Harbor with quiet pride. The key to success had been intelligence. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his codebreakers had cracked Japanese communications, giving us forces an unbeatable edge. With that information, American commanders could place their ships with pinpoint accuracy. President Franklin Roosevelt addressed the nation with restrained confidence, sharing only what was necessary. He said U.S. forces had clashed with the enemy and inflicted serious damage, declaring that momentum was now shifting in America's favor. He knew Midway signaled far more than a win. It was the start of a campaign that would push across the Pacific and toward Japan itself. In Japan, the reaction was stunned silence. Celebrations had been prepared in anticipation of another conquest. Instead, the public was faced with the shocking truth. The pride of their navy had been decimated. In a single blow, the aura of Japanese naval dominance built carefully since their triumph over Russia decades earlier was gone. Destroyed as completely as the carriers themselves. Those who truly grasped naval warfare saw the consequences right away. Japan's capacity to extend its power across the Pacific was now crippled. With the loss of their offensive capabilities, plans to invade Australia or Hawaii were shelved. Japanese troops, trained for offensive action, now found themselves scrambling to defend territory with insufficient preparation or resources. As June 8 dawned, the full extent of America's victory became visible. Recon planes from the Enterprise and Hornet searched the waters for survivors. The sea was littered with life rafts, carrying Japanese sailors who had once believed in the invincibility of their forces, now confronting the bitter truth of defeat and capture. Among those rescued was Captain Mitsuo Fukita, pulled from the ocean by the destroyer Tonikaze. After surviving the Akagi's destruction, badly burned, and barely awake, the man who had led the Pearl Harbor assault whispered a final vow. "This isn't the end. We'll come back." But those nearby knew the old Japan was already fading. Meanwhile, American service members were being hailed as legends. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, whose navigational instincts led the dive bombers straight to their targets, received the Navy Cross for his contribution. Despite low fuel, he had persisted, and that decision had changed history. His actions would be a source of pride for the rest of his life. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, who led Torpedo Squadron 8 to its doom, was honored posthumously, though his body was never recovered. His bravery had drawn Japanese fighters down to low altitudes, clearing the way for the bombers to succeed. The only survivor from his squadron, Ensign George Gay, spent over a day adrift before being found a first-hand witness to history's greatest sea battle. The crew of the Yorktown had their own tale of courage. Severely damaged after Coral Sea, she had continued to fight. Her damage control teams worked wonders to keep her afloat. But when the submarine's torpedoes struck, Captain Elliot Buckmaster watched her slip beneath the waves along with the memories of her battles and the sailors who had served aboard. One of the key contributors to this victory never held a weapon. Commander Joseph Rochefort, who had identified AF as Midway in intercepted messages, had made the entire strategy possible. Working from the HYPO station basement, his deduction allowed the U.S. to prepare perfectly. Without his work, the American fleet would have been striking blindly. There were valiant figures among the Japanese, too, though many of their stories ended in sorrow. Captain Tomio Kaku of the Hiryu stayed at his post to oversee evacuation, choosing to perish with his ship. His final words to command were steeped in tradition: "We've given our all. We are about to attack. We will ram the enemy." Soon after, the carrier exploded. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, who led both the assault on Midway and the last mission against Yorktown, died flying his torpedo bomber through heavy damage to complete his strike. His actions embodied both bravery and the tragic squandering of skilled men Japan could not afford to lose. After the battle, the true extent of Japan's losses became clear. Losing 4 carriers was crushing, but the destruction of their trained airmen was even worse. These weren't just machines, these were men whose training had built the backbone of the Imperial Navy. Their absence could never truly be repaired, no matter how many ships Japan produced. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Pacific War reached a critical moment around a remote atoll, barely known to most Americans. Though the fight had ended, its echoes would continue for the rest of the war and beyond. The Japanese fleet that had once ruled the Pacific had now become a shadow of its former self. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with their aircraft and aircrews, had been lost. Yamamoto's attempt to force a decisive confrontation had failed spectacularly, handing the U.S. a much-needed victory. The illusion of Japanese invulnerability, crafted over months of swift conquest, had been destroyed along with their fleet. From the Aleutians to the Solomons, Japan found itself retreating and defending territory they had once claimed with confidence. In the United States, Midway proved beyond doubt that Japan could be beaten. Still recovering from the sting of Pearl Harbor and defeats in the Philippines and East Indies, the American people finally had cause for optimism. Industry was ramping up, providing new ships, planes, and aviators. The very sleeping giant Yamamoto had warned about was now fully awake. The battle's toll would remain with both nations. Japan lost more than 3,000 men, including its finest aviators, losses that would leave a permanent gap in naval strength. The U.S. suffered far fewer casualties, but every life lost left a hole for those at home. Individual acts of bravery became the legends of Midway. Waldron's final order to attack lived on as a symbol of resolve. Captain Kaku's last transmission spoke volumes about the spirit of those who fought for Japan. Both sides had brave fighters, but only one would walk away victorious. Midway marked the start of America's advance across the Pacific. Not long after, U.S. forces would land at Guadalcanal and begin their push toward Japan. With each battle, the American war machine grew stronger, while Japan's dwindled. Their veteran pilots and skilled sailors were gone, and their replacements could not match them. The tide had shifted permanently. Japan's once secure defensive lines, which had seemed so solid just a month earlier, were now exposed. The planned offensives against Australia and Hawaii were scrapped. Japan now faced an uphill battle against a growing enemy. Yamamoto had accurately forecasted that Japan had only 6 months to dominate before America's industrial strength tipped the scale. His words came true almost to the day, with Midway arriving exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. The days of Japanese supremacy were over. The struggle ahead would be long and brutal. As June 8th came to an end, the sea returned to calm, swallowing the remains of battle rafts, wreckage, and mementos of those who had fallen. The 4 carriers, once icons of Japan's naval power, now lay beneath the waves. Japan had come seeking triumph, but found only ruin. In that moment, the outcome of the Pacific War was sealed. Though the rising sun still fluttered from the mast, Japan's dreams of ruling the Pacific had sunk with their fleet and their finest warriors. The events that unfolded during this pivotal clash in the Pacific left no room for doubt about the shifting balance of power. What had once seemed like an unstoppable force was now clearly vulnerable. The Japanese fleet, once the terror of the seas, had suffered a blow so severe that recovery was nearly impossible. From that point forward, they would never again be able to take the offensive in the same way. Meanwhile, the United States emerged not only with a crucial victory, but with renewed determination and momentum that would carry them across the Pacific. The outcome of this encounter was not just about ships or territory. It marked a turning point in the entire course of the war. Midway changed the direction of history, proving that courage, intelligence, and timing could overcome even the most powerful events.